Good afternoon from London, but I know we have a global audience with us here today. So good morning, good afternoon, or maybe even good evening, wherever you are joining us from today. Thank you for coming into this webinar, which today is called Just in Time, How Real-Time Data Can Improve Government Delivery. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which is a publishing house that serves civil servants all around the world. And also I'd like to thank our knowledge partner today, which is MasterCard. In terms of today's topic, so looking at that real-time data, using real-time data can ensure that policymakers make decisions based on an understanding of the situation as it is, not as it was. And government officials are collecting increasingly large amounts of data from many different sources across both the public and the private sectors. And insights from that real-time data can, however, sometimes get lost if, for example, it takes too long to analyse that information or it's too difficult to share that information with the right policymakers. So in today's webinar, we're going to look at the use of real-time data in the public sector. What do we even mean by real-time data, by that term, and how this type of data is already being used by governments around the world to influence decision-making and improve delivery. And we also will touch on, I think, some of the challenges facing public servants as they look to gather and use this type of data in their policy areas. We've got 4 fantastic speakers with us today, and in a moment I'm going to introduce each of them and ask them to give us some opening remarks. But once they've given their kind of opening remarks, then it's over to you, the audience, to put your questions to our panel. So whichever device you are using, you should see somewhere on your screen a Q&A button. Please use that Q&A function at any point from now on to send in your questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of today's webinar. So in terms of our great panel today, first we will hear from Neil McIver, who is the Chief Data Officer and Chief Statistician at the Department of Education here in the United Kingdom. Neil has more than 20 years' experience in the UK civil service, including senior roles in the Department for Work and Pensions and the Office for National Statistics. His current role at the Department for Education combines accountability and responsibility for information protection and privacy, information governance, data quality, and data lifecycle management, along with the exploitation of data assets to create those insights that I mentioned earlier. And Neil has been voted as one of the most influential data leaders in the UK. So great to have him with us here today. And then we head over to the United States, where we will hear from Stephen Keefe, who is Vice President of Business Development North America for MasterCard. Stephen is responsible for US cities and urban transit there. And he works with government and non-profit entities to accelerate financial inclusion, sustainable and inclusive growth, and strengthen program impact evaluation efforts. Prior to joining MasterCard, Stephen worked for Booz Allen Hamilton as a strategy and operations consultant, where he supported a wide range of government clients and initiatives. So really has that experience working with government and the public sector. And then staying in the United States and in New York, we will hear from Martha Norwick, who is Chief Analytics Officer at the City of New York, and she's head of the Office of Data Analytics there. And the ODA works with agencies and staff across the city to use data to serve New Yorkers more equitably and more efficiently. Martha and her team support citywide programs. They conduct analytics projects to improve city operations and advance citywide data infrastructure, integration, and sharing. And the ODA also includes the New York City Open Data Team, which advocates for the use of open data in the community. And then last, but by no means least, we go over to Canada, where we'll hear from Elise Legendre, who is Chief Data Officer and Director General for Data Policy and Transformation at Agriculture and Agri-Food in Canada. Elise leads a small and passionate team of policy and IT professionals who are dedicated to harnessing and unleashing the power of data to improve service delivery and to support the sector's sustainable growth. Elise joined the federal government in 2003, having worked in strategic marketing in the private sector, and she's since held positions in a range of areas, including strategic policy and corporate management. And she says she's very focused on helping to improve the positive impact that government policies can have on the quality of life for all Canadians. So I'm sure you'll agree with me. We have a brilliant panel with us here today. As I said, please do take this opportunity to pick their brains. So message in all of your questions and we'll get through as many of those as we can. But without further ado, I'm going to come over to Neil, and Neil, invite you to give us some opening thoughts.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to start off just by defining what I mean by real-time data, because often my experience, we get that confusion, don't we, where we use the same words to describe different things or different words to describe the same thing. So this is what I mean when I talk about real-time data. So to me, actual real-time data, that's like sensors in a Formula One car driving around a track where you need to make an immediate information to make immediate decisions, or in open banking. So when I buy something down the shops and I swipe my card, it automatically appears on my bank statement. I then refer to something called near real-time data, and that's something that I deal with a lot more in my context, and that's something like overnight batch transfer, so that something's happening during the day, I get a batch transfer overnight, and I can do stuff with it the next day. And then thirdly, I talk about timely data. So in the world of statistics and analysis, we make decisions whether we publish something and that publication needs to be daily or weekly or fortnightly or quarterly or what have you. But the important thing is the timeliness. It's the difference between the reference period that that publication talks to and when the publication's made. And that definition is different in different contexts. So I was chatting to someone from banking fraud last week, and to them, real-time data was immediate, as I've defined it. To them, near real-time data was a delay of a few seconds, whereas I'm saying it's next day. But with real-time data and near real-time data, in my head, there's an awful lot of overlap. Real-time data or near real-time data are derived from operational systems that need to run those operations in real time. And really, the statistics or the analysis that we need to do on the back of it often to understand which policies work and what works in a policy context are a byproduct of those processes. Very important, but still a byproduct, almost like a secondary product. So when we start thinking about if we need real-time data, we've got to think about the process that data supports. So I haven't yet done my tax return for the 2023 tax year, because in the UK, I've got until January 24 to do that. So you'll never get real-time data on my earnings. But now more than ever, we need to do timely statistics. We want to know about child poverty, what child poverty was like last month, not what it was 18 months ago. And in able to measure what works in government, we also really need to think about end-to-end data pipelines and how these overlap with business processes and where the decision points made. So if we decide we need some real-time data, do we actually need to change the business process in order to enable that? And what impact might that have on the wider purposes of that business process? So I would say I'm quite a simple soul. And to me, end-to-end data pipelines, from the most complicated to the most simple, I like to boil it down into 3 basic steps. And those steps is, first of all, you've got to get the data. You've got to put it somewhere, and then you've got to use it. Now, when I'm saying get the data and put it somewhere, that could be virtualization. It doesn't have to be physical transfers, but it helps me in my simple brain to think about get, put, and use as 3 steps to a process. And in the UK and in government in particular, we talk an awful lot about how to use the data, and it's really, really important, isn't it? Because if you're not going to use it, there's no point getting it and putting it anywhere in the first place. But one of the problems is we often forget about some basic principles. So, for example, if we want to do something and we take an end user view of the data pipeline rather than an end-to-end view, we actually don't often get the data we need or put it somewhere appropriate, and that inhibits our ability to use it properly. So how often, for example, do we put operationally critical data into loads of ungoverned spreadsheets that drive error, needs cottage industries of people to pull it together, quality assure it, and publish it? How often do we not think about mastering data to create a single source of truth so that we ensure that the data are structured and modeled in a way that enables tens of thousands, for example, of bespoke dashboards to run in real time in a performance manner? That's one of my services that I'll just touch on at the end of my opening address here. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on get, put, use, but shameless self-publication here. If you want to go onto my LinkedIn site, I've published a deck about getting to need the basics, about how to get data, and 10 questions we should all ask ourselves about that. But really, in my simple head, it boils down to these things. If the data doesn't exist, someone's got to create it. And if there's a legal basis for that, it's mandatory. You still have to think about the burdens. So for me, I really want schools to be learning establishments. I don't want them to be data factories. So really think about the burdens and the impact. And if it's voluntary, what are the incentives for suppliers to commit time and money and effort to doing this for you? Even with grant funding, some people might decide that the burden that we are putting on the data collection is greater than the utility they would get from applying for the grant in the first place. So think about all of that lot. And just to finish off, I'm just going to put a little flag about the daily school attendance data project that my team have been successfully running. So in 6 months, the team devised a system to collect daily pupil attendance data in near real time. Massive policy need in the UK at the moment. Attendance hasn't picked up to pre-pandemic levels. There are real safeguarding issues around that. You know, we still have over 22% of our children are classified as persistently absent from school. That means that they, on a time period, miss 10% or more of the sessions that they should be attending. In a nutshell, the project was at no cost to the schools, who are legal entities in their own right, and it gave them valuable insight on the trends of school absence at an individual level. So basically, we made it easy for the school so they didn't have to munch the numbers themselves. So as I said before, you know, I want schools to be teaching establishments, not data factories. We did the data munching for them, gave them the impact so they could make some real-time decisions on student absence. So basically, we automatically pull attendance registers from schools every night, zero burden on the school, and we play back near real-time, individual level bespoke dashboards to those schools, regional authorities, and that enables that easy insight. And to finish off with some numbers on the scale of that, so 85% of schools in England volunteered to do that because it was no burden. That's 19,000 schools. I flow about 14 million datas into the department daily to do that. 19,000 fully automated bespoke dashboards. About 7 billion records, just attendance records, sit in my data lakehouse. So we had to re-engineer our data lakehouse. We had to put it somewhere properly. And then we managed to tweak this on a day of an industrial action, so I could scrape the data on the hour, every hour during the days of teacher strikes. And that meant I pulled in 80 million records those days. And I managed to publish at 4 o'clock that same afternoon the impact of the strike on those days. And that's where I'll finish. Thank you, Siobhan.
Neil, thank you so much. I think it's a brilliant way to start there with that presentation, because you set out some kind of fundamental thinking points, I think. So what do we even mean, as say, by the term? So you had it there, kind of 3 different categories that you think of this type of data in. So the real-time data, the near real-time data, and then the timely data. That's one way of kind of thinking about this type of data. And then I really like what you say about looking at, because you're right, a lot of times we talk about the end user when we're talking about data, but looking at that end-to-end pipeline. So how do you get it, where do you put it, and how do you use it? And then stressing there, making it as least burdensome as possible for the people who you're asking to supply that data and gather that data. And really nice as well to have that case study. So how you're doing that from the Department of Education to help schools and local authorities look at those trends in terms of school attendance, so important for children's wellbeing, which just shows how data can be used, as we're doing here, to get insights into all of these different kind of policy areas. Thank you so much, Neil. Great place to start. And I'm sure that's already given the audience lots of food for thought. Stephen, we're coming over to you now.
Awesome. Fantastic. Can you hear me okay, Siobhan?
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. All good.
Wonderful. Well, first off, it's a privilege to be part of this panel today and speaking with my esteemed colleagues. And I just want to say thank you to the civil servants that are on this panel, and also to the audience and joining. Having worked in this space for 15 years, I know your job is hard and it's incredibly impactful and drives our own quality of life. So thank you very much, and hopefully you'll get some key insights from this presentation. So just real quickly, so as Siobhan said, I work for MasterCard in our public sector side. And for those who don't know, we work across a range of solutions and capabilities with governments globally, from obviously what you know from around our payments core business and helping modernize payments and effectively there, from our cybersecurity solutions to protecting cities and government entities. And then what we'll talk about more today around the data and the data that we derive from that payments network. In the US alone, we capture about 40 billion transactions annually. So it's representative of a near real-time data set, as Neil positioned, or maybe even timely if we go to that weekly or monthly data set, depending on how you want to ingest it. So what I'll dig a little bit deeper into is, as we've worked with cities across the board and understanding and go deep with them on what are their needs, what are their challenges, what are the insights they need to derive, is what are those learnings that we've captured from those discussions? How are cities and public entities and nonprofits looking at near real-time economic data today, and how are they driving it to improve delivery? So I'll walk through a couple of those use cases and then speak a little bit more specifically about really a great use case and a partnership with New York City and Martha, and she'll be able to go a little bit deeper into that. But first thing, as we've kind of gone out and spoken with cities and governments, especially over the past 3 years since COVID, increase in natural disasters, and really needing more of a near real-time economic data set that's not only accessible and representative of what's happening now in a local area, a very localized area, down almost to the neighborhood or block level, but then being able to layer those over some of those either initiatives or events that are happening in a city, so they can get near real-time indicators of, are things progressing, are they hitting in a danger zone, and what levers can a city pull in order to enact some type of change. And so really when we think about it, when we think about natural disasters that are hitting, just in the US alone, there are 18 disasters that were costing $1 billion or more. They're coming more frequent, they're hitting cities. What's happening? They need to know where it's happening and how can they engage and hopefully get on a path to recovery. We're also seeing this in other areas around economic growth within the tourism space. How can they use economic data more real time to optimize their own investments and engagements, from what types of events, how can they drive spend across a city just versus it being isolated? And how is that mapping against the investments that they're planning forward? So we're seeing a lot of interest in tourism, inclusive recovery, and using that near-term economic data to inform those types of decisions, investments, or even investments requests. I think another big theme just outside of that is the focus on equitable and inclusive recovery. So previous data sets have largely been at a more aggregated level, at a city level, which is a good indicator of what's happening. When we think about a city of being inclusive and equitable, there are neighborhoods that are not growing, that are in a dire state, that need more economic vitality in order to make them more sustainable. And so we're seeing a lot of cities take this economic data and overlay it with other public and private data that gives social indicators of what's happening, and being part of those inclusive and equitable strategies, looking at it from the past, where have they been, what's happening now, and then hopefully being able to track and evaluate what's happening in the near future and become more predictable. So those cities that are creating those equitable strategies, this is a data set that a lot are leaning into and finding a tremendous amount of value from. I think finally, as we've worked with cities, is that now they're looking at how do they create and start to do more contest and control based methods. So taking some near real time with economic spending data, and as Neil said, there's other near real time data that they can start to look at. And when you have it more broadly collected across a city that can be broken down into different geographic quadrants or other elements, you can start to experiment and see what happens when we give an intervention to one city or one block or one neighborhood or one street or a couple, and others don't, that some are lookalike. And you can start to see, well, what's the uplift, either in spending data, whether you want to do no harm, does it stay stable by putting a bike lane or bus lane where others didn't get it? Do you see increased traffic? Do you see decreased traffic? And these are some really advanced methods that cities are doing themselves or working with entities like MasterCard to do it with them. And so we're really getting more advanced in understanding those things, that policymakers can now have insights to go to their citizens and show what's working, what's not, and hopefully get promote more. So those are some of the three examples that we're seeing really across the board. And a final example I'll touch on before handing over to Martha is really, we've had a fantastic partnership with New York City for a number of years, including with COVID, and worked closely with them from getting that economic data resource during COVID to now advancing into what are use cases that the mayor is interested in that are going to be used. And so we collectively identified what was called an Open Streets initiative that was with the mayor that was pedestrianizing commercial corridors in the city during the holiday season. And the city and those who were running the program knew that it looked like it did well. It looked like we, drove traffic, but they didn't have the data to really justify it. And so when our teams got together and looked at it, we actually were able to uncover a $3 million uplift in spend across different corridors. We're able to see, hey, what happens when you partially close a street versus fully close a corridor? What about at different hours of the day? What's the impact of that? And so they're able to finally show there was spending uplift in these areas. There was increased transactions, so foot traffic coming into those areas. And as they're approaching 2023 season and they're trying to continually support local businesses and get that local spend happening in the city, they can now lean on that and now look to promote it again and hopefully tailor it and even do it even better. The city invested, I think, about $200,000 in marketing it. Now, hopefully they can even do more and continue to grow and have that target economic growth. So just a really fantastic use case. It is available if you Google it to see a press release, you can learn more. But with that, I did want to pass over to Martha, and a big thank you again, just to all the work that you do, an incredible division. And I'll pass it over to you to talk about all the really the great important things that you're doing with the city, and happy to go a little bit deeper into the initiative. But over to you, and again, thanks to the panel.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's been a wonderful partnership with MasterCard, and I think I'd love to just give a little background of sort of how that partnership came to be and what our what we're thinking about at the City of New York in terms of real-time data, additional data that are generated by processes that are outside of the public sector, which I think certainly during the pandemic, this was the genesis of this partnership with MasterCard, as well as with some other outside data providers. Yes, I'm Martha Norick. I'm the Chief Analytics Officer of the City of New York. I run the Office of Data Analytics, as Siobhan mentioned. We work very closely with the city's administrative data to help better understand processes, operations, help improve government service delivery. Just for a little bit of context, New York City has almost 300,000 municipal employees. We're about the size of global Starbucks, so it's a very large organization. I am not the only, we are not the only team using data in the City of New York by a long stretch, but we are sort of the kind of central coordinating body for data analytics. So we support lots of folks across the city who are working with data that are generated by citizens every day. In New York City, some of the data sets that we work with frequently that are sort of near real time include calls for service, so calls to the emergency line, to 911 or to 311, which is the city's sort of non-emergency service line. We also work with data that are collected via sensors. As Neil said, some of that sort of more, true real time, I guess, or near real time. Yeah, you're right. There's so many words that you can use to describe the same things. Work with data that are generated via sensor, particularly in transportation. That's a big source of information, and also a place where people can make decisions in fairly near time. But I think for many years, the administrative data generated by the City of New York is sort of, it was the speed of the data creation and collection, and sort of those end-to-end pipelines were really sort of driven by driven by kind of the business processes and the use cases that people had, and then the pandemic happened, and all of that stuff kind of blew up. And there was just this incredible hunger for better information at a faster pace than what we were going to get from our regular sort of administrative processes. Some of those administrative processes, weren't happening the same way that they used to. There had to be, incredible amounts of kind of rejiggering of things to figure out how to collect information. If teachers aren't in school buildings and we're taking attendance for Zoom classes, like how do we need to change the way that we're doing that in order to reflect this sort of new reality? or a lot of the processes that in the city that happen in congregate settings, in addition to obviously schools, but senior centers or help centers where people could come in and apply for benefits, or other sorts of places where we were just had to kind of rapidly shut down because it wasn't safe to have people together. Our office was getting just a million questions a day about what can we say, what can we tell from the data that the city is collecting, and the answer was, oof, like, we're not going to see quarterly sales tax receipts for a little while here. So we're not going to be able to answer these questions without some different and more different and creative uses of data. And so our office created and ran an effort called the Recovery Data Partnership, where we went out and looked for sources of data that we could turn to that were not generated via sort of the regular governmental processes, but instead were more, hopefully closer to real-time information about what was happening in New York City, both economically, but also in terms of health. We had a partnership with a smart thermometer company that every time somebody took their temperature via one of these smart thermometers, that data was captured, and we were able to work with that. But really, I think the big question. The really big questions were around economic activity. What was happening in the city? New York City is a city of commuters. The sort of daytime patterns of the city are that lots of people move from the sort of outer rings of the city into the central business district. The central business district was a ghost town. I'm sure some of you maybe have seen some spooky pictures of Times Square during the pandemic, where there's just not a single person around, which is a very unusual experience. But those people that came into the central business district and spent, bought lunch and spent money on things, they were somewhere. Were they still spending money? Were they spending money locally? Was it all sort of had all of the economic activity moved to online spending? Those are questions that we worked together with MasterCard to try to better understand sort of how those patterns of economic spending had changed. And one thing that we found, working together with MasterCard and that data was really kind of that a lot of the economic spending that had been kind of happening in the central business district during the day was instead happening in the other 4 boroughs of the city of New York, or in areas of Manhattan that are more sort of residential than sort of the commercial business corridors. So that was a very important understanding for the city, that that not all of this economic activity had disappeared. It had just sort of shifted geographic patterns of spending in the city. Although certainly we missed our friends who come in from New Jersey and Connecticut and other areas of the tri-state area. Yeah, and I think one thing I think a lot about too, with sort of the speed of data or the cadence of data collection, is what is the cadence that you can really kind of create meaning out of with data. I think everybody, I sort of joke sometimes that if you can tell whether or not someone is a real data person based on like how many like screens of dashboards they have up on their wall. Like if you have more than 4 screens, like, are you really getting any meaning out of that? Probably not. Kind of the like enhance, or like a CSI style thing where you're like, oh gosh, you're just surrounded by data, but like, is there any meaning in this? Can you actually kind of are you learning something? Are you able to really kind of create meaning out of this data as it's flowing in? And I think the partnership, the project that Stephen mentioned, where we're using real-time economic data, where we're able to kind of slice and dice it pretty finely for a specific time period and a specific geography, but we're thinking about the meaning on sort of a less than real-time scale, right? Like we can't actually tell if pedestrianizing Fifth Avenue over the holidays is leading to a increased economic spending in that geography and time period without having that time period finish and then comparing it to another area of the city that has comparable, foot traffic or economic activity. And so, yeah, I think, one thing that I find myself doing sometimes is really kind of helping people consider whether or not real-time data is actually what they need. They think they want it, but sometimes the question that they're trying to answer is not actually answerable in real time. And if you answer it in real time, you might get it wrong because there just hasn't been enough information to really kind of discern a pattern in a meaningful fashion. I think that's where I'm going to leave you. So I'm going to turn it back over to
Brilliant.
Siobhan.
Martha, thank you so much. I'm going to work backwards from what you said there, because a couple of words of caution I think you put there in the end. One is about, I think it's a challenge that a lot of our audience will have sympathy with, which is with all of this data out there, how do you actually know which data is the most useful data for you? There's a lot of noise. How do you actually find the message in all of that noise? And then also alongside maybe some of this real-time or near real-time data, don't lose sight of the need or the benefits of that longer term analysis as well. So a couple of words of caution at the end there, but really interesting what Stephen and you have said there about how data is being used in cities, in New York City in particular. So what I really loved was that the way that you talked about COVID as kind of this period that built a lot of these partnerships, I think, between the private sector and the public sector, a real period of innovation and trying out, experimenting with things differently, but building those partnerships that you're now using in other ways as well. So Stephen, what you talked about, how now you can experiment using real-time data to really get down to kind of community level or neighborhood level, or playing around with timings of a policy when you might deploy a policy. So actually getting quite micro in some of this as well, and that focus on using that then to make sure that your policies are helping everybody as most inclusive and equitable, as well as kind of overall benefits for the city. So much there to unpack. Thank you to Martha and to Stephen. And I can see we've got lots of questions coming in already, but without going over to the questions now, we're going to hear from Elise, who I'm sure has got lots now to add to what we've already heard. So Elise, over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Thank you to my fellow panelists. It's a very inspiring conversation so far. I really appreciate all your example, and I can relate on so many levels. So I'm the Chief Data Officer for Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, the federal Department for Agriculture and Food in Canada. And it's an interesting place to be because we are in a situation where we work very closely with provinces as well. So our stakeholders are diverse in addition to the industry and so on and so forth. And I think that appetite that you were talking about, Martha, about the pandemic creating that pull to really get information and be more creative and inventive and innovative in the way we were getting information because of the changes was definitely a driver for us as well in terms of, so what's the impact on Canadian, what's the impact on the agriculture and the food sector, for example, with the stop of travel, international travel. We, like a lot of economies, rely on temporary foreign workers that come from other countries to come and work in our industry. So how do we know how it's happening? Are they coming? Several, not just within our own department, but I would say it also helped redefine the way we share data and the challenges that we have between departments and between ministries when we are sharing some responsibility, right? Where before the pandemic, I would say it was probably a little bit more stiff in the way we were doing it and hierarchical. I would say the crisis showed you the art of the possible when you really need to get to something, how collaborative we can really be when push comes to shove, I would say. I've been in this job for about 2 years now, and I would say I'm not a techie, and I was thinking it had a lot to do with technology, but the very quickly realized it's a lot about people. Being able to make some changes and being able to make some progress is really about the people, the way we work together, the way we collaborate. Data is a team sport is often what I say as well. And you're talking about policy and question that we need to answer. I think it's very important to focus the mind. My department is also a scientific department. We do a lot of science. So data is not an issue. We have a lot of data. We have sensor in fields and all sorts of places, Earth observation, and even just making sense of what we have is a challenge in and of itself, understanding the potential of it. is important. And I see Neil nodding, and I'm thinking of the schools, right? They collect the attendance data for one purpose. We do a lot of fit for purpose connection, right? And I think that the true value and the real impact comes when we're able to collect data once and use it for multiple purposes, and being able to leverage it to help answer other questions, to lighten that burden on the folks that are providing the data, but at the same time in respect of security, privacy, and all of these things. So I think it's a really interesting mix of soft skills and people skills, but also that technical knowledge, that understanding really what are those questions that you're trying to answer. And Martha, you said something about you might not have, like I often ask people, tell me what is the question you want to answer. Don't tell me the data you need. I don't think we're there yet. I want to understand what's that challenge you're trying to address. And then we'll work together to find what is the best amalgamation of different sources. And it brings in and of itself, like I said, a challenge on the way we work, particularly in the public service, with all the rules that are in place, which are important. Those checks and balances are important, but it does require a change of culture and a change of focus in that collaborative area, I would say. Like I said, often people come to us telling us, I want this piece of data. And we're like, but why and how? And what are you trying to do with it? And Neil, your definition of real-time, near real-time, timely, and the links you guys are making between that comparability. Once you have that real-time data, how do you know that it's really doing? So the data quality and the validation is super important, and it's an iterative process. I think that's the other part that is important. And as soon as you start answering those questions and you start getting that data, if you're not able to compare it to other longitudinal data, or you're not able to challenge yourself and be sure that you are indeed getting the information, maybe not the perfect information. I would say that's the other challenge, is folks often want to have the perfect data or the perfect information. You need to find that sweet spot when you're good enough to get going. You're good enough to start unpeeling and taking off the layers and understanding the issue. And I think from the public service perspective, it's a very critical challenge that we have to take on, because it speaks about the relevance of the public service, our ability to be able to explain what we do, the impact of the investment that we make, not just of the dollar, what does it bring, but that ripple effect that Neil was talking about as well. And that lens of diversity and inclusiveness that Stephen was talking to is also super important. That ability to make sure that our policy are actually having the impact that we want them to have. And if not, to be able to course correct quickly enough, right? Those are all the reasons why it's important to invest ourselves in that real-time or near real-time, and really understand those partnerships so that we are able to provide better service and enhance the impact of government for population. So I think I'll leave it at that and see how we can go on with questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I wrote down so much there. I think, so I've got that. I loved what you said about data is a team sport, and that, I'm not techie either. And I think every time we do events on data, it strikes me absolutely what you said there, right? It's as much about people and culture as it is about the technology. And you then going back, as Martha did, to that COVID period, how it was all about better collaboration. So actually sharing data, being more flexible and speedy in how you share data was so important when we're talking about these kind of issues. And that mix then of the skills that civil servants are going to need. So some of the softer skills as well as some of the technical skills as well. And then crucial, I think, in terms of all of you have kind of touched on this, in terms of understanding, because there's so much data out there, where do you start? You need to know what policy question you're trying to answer before you go out and try and gather data. And if you don't know that, you're going to be gathering all sorts of data that may or may not be useful. And then the other things I wrote down there that you mentioned, how do you make sure that the quality of the data is such that you can compare and contrast across with other data sets as well? And then finally, I think, which is what Stephen touched on as well, is how do you use that data then to justify investment, because you can use that data to show the impact very quickly that a policy is having, or to shift course if it's not having the desired impact. Thank you so much to all of you for such brilliant presentations. As I said, we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm going to go straight to the audience questions. The first question was actually to you, Neil, from your one, but I think anyone can answer these, so I'm going to give you all a chance as well. This was from Davina, Neil, and she said you mentioned kind of a single source of truth for data. So she was saying, could you unpick that a little bit? What do you mean? How does the UK government, how would they ensure a single source for truth of truth for data?
Yeah, so we do have some open data reference sets around the place. So, for example, the one that springs to mind for me is Companies House. Whenever you set yourself up as a limited company or a business, you have to register with Companies House, and that's open to everybody. And it's like a single list of businesses, and it's great as well. So you can look at the published accounts for those businesses, and enables you to do that. And I think we're good in some areas, and we've got a long journey to go in other areas as well, because I often come across conflicting. There's a single source of truth, and there's multiple sources of half truths, aren't there, in a lot of areas we work on? But I think it's more about getting the processes right. You know, as everyone said, you know, there's people, processes, technology. Sort of, I'm a little bit tech agnostic. As long as you've got the right people with the right processes, things tend to work out. And part of this is making sure, if you are responsible for data in your department, have you actually set up domain data ownership model so that someone in a domain has ownership of all the stuff around that domain, and that's a way of getting master data management into a system. And also as well, it's when you're setting up a new system, it might be an operational delivery, it might be setting up a new tax benefit service or what have you. Really important that you actually get the right experts in at the systems thinking stage of development. So have you got your data architects and your data modelers mapping the business process and the end-to-end business pros as part of your whole system thinking end-to-end of building a new service?
Thanks, Neil. Elise or Martha, did you want to come in on this one? Because obviously I imagine you're thinking about that as well from government's or your city perspective. Martha, did you want to come in on?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, the one thing I was thinking about both with kind of this question and also the question about kind of the creative use of interpreting and gathering data. I think I'm trying to find the right way to phrase this. There's certainly, data is always kind of a like slightly weird reflection of reality, right? Like we can never kind of completely have data, you know, what is data representing? And I think that kind of like single source of truth question is an interesting one, and sometimes you might want a couple of different versions of a data set in order to understand kind of, you know, every data generation process introduces its own sort of quirks to that data set. I was thinking, you know, while folks were talking about kind of how we think about, you know, how we try to consider the data generation process and what biases that might introduce into a data set. So for example, in New York City, there's lots of questions about rats. Where are all the rats? What are the rattiest neighborhoods in the city? And people frequently turn to the 311 data set, which is this data set of non-emergency calls to the city. But if you think about the type of person who sees a rat and calls the city, they're really weird. A lot of people just see rats and think, a rat. I don't need to call anybody, like there's a rat over there. And so, you know, when people use data sets, you know, and that data set it is the source of truth for 311 calls. It is an important data set to the city. It helps us understand, you know, what people are looking for, but it also doesn't really reflect reality. There's rats everywhere. Nobody ever calls 311 about it. Like they're just living their lives, their little rat lives, and that's okay. But the trouble comes when people sort of think about using data sets as representations of reality when actually the data generation process means that we're seeing a little window into sort of what's actually happening. And until
That's
all the little
really,
rats are wearing sensors, we'll never know.
that's really interesting, because I think that gives a whole different perspective. Some, quite often people, when they're answering the question about a single source of truth, don't sit back and think, actually, maybe we do want more than one kind of source here, and you need to be looking at it in that way. I would have thought bed bugs was a bigger issue than rats, but that's because we have a bed bug issue in London at the moment. But Elise, did you want to add anything
Just
on
quickly, and I couldn't agree more with both the speaker. I think a single source of truth, the way I usually use it, is in that the basic information. Can we have one, if I'm thinking of an industry, for example, let's say the cattle industry, can I know what's the source for the number of farms, the number of animals, blah, 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 and have it down? Like, and I agree with you. It's when you start comparing with other things that you can start doing some interesting and creative analysis. But I think there's a place for that. I'd say that single source of truth, which will remove a lot of noise in the organization, so people are sure that they're working with the same data and a lot of that. And it sounds it doesn't sound important, but it is in a big organization that is across the country and everything else, like making sure that you have that basic. But it also speaks to folks that own the data owner and the data custodian, knowing what they have, what's the data, where it comes from, what's their limits, what's their, all of these things, and finding a way to collate that information in an organization so that you can easily get to Martha's point on the rat call. Yeah, it's a good indicator. We can look at the delta and see whether weird people or rats are moving in different areas, right? Because it depends what it is. But that importance of the data management and the role of those data steward in an organization is so crucial.
Yeah, thanks, Elise. Stephen, I'm going to put, I
was going to add to that, from the private sector perspective, I want to echo what Elise and Martha just said on understanding the data. So Martha clearly understands the rat data collection process, and someone who takes that could interpret that and publish something that is not representative of that data set. The same can be true from the data that you procure from the private sector. And so that partnership is critically important, not only for them to give you the details on what's collected, where the nuances are, and where those caveats are, but also being able to access them and have them as a trainer or expert person that can, the city can take it and digest it and do some manipulation, but looping back with those experts and saying, here's what we think these insights are telling us. Is that true? Or do we have some nuance that we are not aware of because it's not our data set? And Martha has been really good about getting into the weeds with us and kind of sharing that, so that when we do share those insights, it's known. And so it can be dangerous when you buy a data set and push it out to 300,000 employees. I think goes into your data training, is that people can get data sets and take them and can do some things that may not be representative, and then that gets hard to pull back. So.
Which I guess really highlights again what you've all said, the importance of those partnerships and the communication between those partners as well. Stephen, I'm going to stick with you first on this one. So this came in from Terence, and he said, real-time data accumulation, it's going to lead to an increased need for flexible and sustainable storage. So this is all about storage. How do you address these increased data storage needs? So his question was a very practical one. What systems are you using? So on-premises systems, cloud, or hybrid systems? So Stephen, I'm going to ask you first, because yours might be slightly different from the three speakers that we have from the public sector.
Yeah, sure. From our perspective, it depends. It depends on how the government wants to consume and their limitations on the storage capacity. So from an economic data perspective, we do have solutions that sit in the cloud that are SaaS-based and they're platform-based. And so you can go in and do the analysis and the data is there. We do also offer the flexibility for governments to have to obtain those data, collect the data, and store it and manipulate it. So for us, it really depends on the requirements and our own privacy and data standards that we have to look at. But I would say it does depend on what the government is trying to do in our customers.
Thanks, Stephen. Neil, I'll come to you on this one, because this issue of, as we collect more and more data in the public sector, where is it going to be stored and how is it going to be stored is a real issue already, isn't it?
Well, absolutely, yeah. And I think the first thing we should address is do we need to physically transfer data? or not. There are certain things we can do through virtualization, leaving data at source and actually just doing things sort of remotely on that one. And it all boils down to purpose as well. Now, the second most important thing is when you're looking at your data collection and you're doing your data collection privacy impact assessments and things like that, be really, really clear about what your retention periods are and why you've got those retention periods. I have some very long retention periods for some things, which necessitates us keeping them for a long time, and I have shorter retention periods for other things. But again, it's like with all things, isn't it? You know, every petabyte of data that we store has not only an economic impact, it costs money to store things, but it also has an environmental impact as well. You know, the big data centers churning out quite a lot of impacts, environmental impacts as well. So you just need to balance everything up at the same time. But yeah, we're mainly cloud at the moment. We have to be cloud because it offers enormous benefits. We do have some on-prem stuff that's legacy that we're moving away from at the moment, but it just helps us setting up virtual machines and dropping down virtual machines as and when we need them.
Thanks. We do have lots of questions coming in, but Elise, I'm going to give you, and then Martha, anything you wanted to add on data storage.
Absolutely. I think I'm again still not a techie, so I'm not going to go on the different means that we use because I know we're using all of the possible means. Being a science department, it is front and center. How do you store data? How long do you keep it? How do you keep it? There's also the aging infrastructure that come into play. I'm sure Neil and Martha are dealing with the same kind of things where we're running out of runway and we need to modernize the way we do things. It's a very burning challenge, and again, I think Neil pointed to virtualization and other ways. We also need to modernize the way we think about data because it's not just the legacy system; it's the legacy thinking sometimes that gets in the way. But it brings up that capacity to take risk, right? Not being risk averse, entering into partnership, making sure that if you don't own it, how do you make sure that you're going to have access to it? My scientists want to be able to publish papers and they have to be able to provide data to their colleagues to validate their findings, right? So there's a whole lot of challenge that we have to think about. It's definitely top of mind for us.
I also think one of the big challenges has been the procurement process and sort of the ways that the procurement process hasn't kept pace with the ways technology has changed. So, for example, in New York City, only recently could you use capital expense dollars on data storage that wasn't sort of physical on-prem servers. So there's ways that sort of and I think similarly, for some of the work when during the pandemic, when we were running the Recovery Data Partnership, most of our partnerships were pro bono because private companies were really looking for ways to help the city, in a really difficult time. But as this program has evolved, as our sort of, to Elise's point, right? Like we want to make sure that the sort of guidelines are clear about what data we have access to, what we can use it for, what if we have products that we create using that data, what are the rules for publishing them or for offering up models or things that are built off of data that we paid for, or that that the city doesn't own itself, and those sort of contractual relationships and the ways that we partner with folks, both on the storage side, but then also on kind of like the data acquisition side. I think a lot of that stuff is kind of evolving rapidly along with as technology and data as a service has evolved as well.
Thanks, Martha. Well, that's a nice way to move into the next. I'm going to put two questions together and ask you very quickly, all of you, on this one, and then I'm just going to separately ask you some questions after that. But Mohad Talaha has said, how do you tackle the urge to collect nice to have types of data? So this is, how do you stop civil servants, public servants collecting data just because it's nice to have? I want to combine that with, because you mentioned how new technology is going to change everything. So Majid Benjulam has said, how do you see all of this will be impacted by AI? So data and AI, and then the need to gather, or the desire to just keep gathering lots and lots of data. Elise, I'm going to come to you first. You can answer one or both of those together.
That's interesting because I do have a Center of Excellence on AI also in my team. And I'm going to speak back to the basic, right? Back to basic in data management. You need to do your data management well so that you can, really leverage those cool technologies and those fancy things. And that desire, it all goes down to how's your data governance, are your data stewardship, getting good data hygiene and data management in place, lifecycle management. One of the points I try to make often, and I'm not sure I've quite won that one yet, but that we start treating data like an asset, like a tractor that we would buy, like other things that we would acquire for the department. So absolutely, it's and the notion of bias. What's that data? What are the limits of it? As I said earlier, is there bias in the data? How do you correct that? How do you make sure that you are using data that is feeding your AI models or your in a way that is not perpetuating systemic issues, for example? So there's a lot of work happening on that front, not just with us at the AFC, but with our Statistics Canada, which is our main body, to try to address these things at the outset as we're starting to use that technology going forward and making sure that we do it for the greater good, right? Because we're the public service, we work for the greater good.
Thanks, Elise. Stephen, your thoughts on kind of just nice to have data and then AI and data?
Yeah, what I'm saying is, start with the desired outcome first, and then work backwards. And so, do you have the data to understand that, measure that outcome? That should be a must-have, or get as close as you can with leading indicators, and move backwards from how you can make the informed decisions to reach that outcome. So if it's community economic growth, I'll just stay on the economic side since we're on. Do you have an indicator of that community? And then do you have any leading indicators that are also, understanding, like, are you on track to meet that outcome? And those should be ones that are core. And then you kind of work down and say, well, which ones are then nice to have on top of that, and kind of go through that process. So that's how I always usually try to start. What's the outcome? What are the inputs you need from inputs activities to reach that outcome?
Thanks, Stephen. Neil, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to come from left field on this one a little bit, because I've often talked about, do you need this data or do you just want it? But you do have to realize sometimes, I think, that just understanding what's going on is just as important as actually needing something, because you're going to make an operational change to it. So I address this from a different sort of angle, and I look at the cost and the opportunity cost of this. So we just need to be open about what it's going to cost us in pounds and pence, or dollars and cents, wherever you're coming from. What's it going to cost us in time? What's it going to cost us in resource to be able to do this? And what is the opportunity cost? What else could you be doing with those people and that money? And if you then decide that just wanting nice to have data is the most important thing you can do with that money, then that's absolutely fine, and we should do that. So I think that for me, it's really about making sure that we're very clear and open on the burden versus benefit dynamic, and making sure that we understand the whole end-to-end value chain. I think the problem is most people think data is a free good, and if I wave my wand, someone over there is just going to do it for me. I wonder if the conversation would be different if I cross-charged all my policy colleagues every time they asked me to collect a piece of data. Very quickly feeding into the AI, I'm just going to go back to my three basics, because again, I'm simple soul. AI is just a different way of using data. We've still got to get it and put it somewhere to use it. So going back to my first questions, do the data we need to drive a large language model exist anywhere? If not, we'll have to gather it and collate it somewhere. Does it exist in digital format? So hypothetically, if I wanted to feed in primary school work into an AI, generative AI model, well, most of the primary school work is like stuck on walls with blue tack or drawing pins, isn't it? Does it exist? If it exists, does it exist in a digital format? If it exists in a digital format, is it in a place where you can actually drive your large language models on it? And then you've got the whole ethics and data protection and intellectual property right around that, which I'm not going into because that would take days.
Thanks, Neil. Martha, I have got another specific question for you, but did you want to add anything on data and AI, or?
Sure. Yeah. Just one thing on the AI question. I it's something that has obviously is top of mind for lots of folks, and the things that the large language models and some of the work that's happening around those like generative models right now is really exciting. But I also think as two things. One, I think the most exciting sort of application for large language models in the government context is that most governments are sitting on a huge amount of unstructured text data. So that could be like transcripts, or it could be, free text fields on forms that people fill in. And most of the time, I think that data doesn't get used very frequently because it's difficult, it's difficult to do kind of like NLP style analysis on. There's a lot of it. So I do think some of the applications for large language models of interpreting or sort of summarizing or looking at free text is an interesting application. But I also do think that, I would be very hesitant to use it in a way that drives operational decision making at this moment, just because of the proclivity to hallucinate and a lot of things that I think we're still learning about these models. But it is one of the things that I think is kind of an exciting application in a way to use some data that is maybe classified as like nice to have information. Like everybody loves to leave a text box for people to fill stuff in, but then if nobody ever looks at it, like why
Yeah.
are we doing it?
Yeah.
So that's exciting.
Thanks, Mark. I do have a specific question I wanted
Yes.
to put to you as well, because this is coming from Chantal. And I did mention at the beginning that you're also responsible for kind of providing open data to New Yorkers as well. And the question from Chantal is, how do you balance the importance of open data, so sharing data with the public, and the public's varying ability to truly understand what the data says? So I think it goes back to your rat issue, really, but this is in specifically to the public. Do you have to kind of do a comms exercise around data when you share data with the public? How do you approach that?
Yes, we think about this question all the time. It is a great question. I think the era of just dumping all of your data on the internet with no additional context or ability to interpret it is not serving anybody. It's just creating a random task for government employees, and it is not serving the public. So a couple of things that we think a lot about. One is that idea of stewardship and documentation, and how can we make sure that every single data set that's provided to the public comes with a robust data dictionary, with a person to contact at that particular agency if you have questions about the data set, the data owner. Our data dictionary format we've worked on with librarians and with members of the public to do sort of like user design sessions around what a data dictionary for the public looks like, how to make sure that we're sort of capturing the caveats that folks would that folks who work with the data every day, just kind of have in the back of their heads, but that aren't necessarily obvious to the public. I think does everybody open and carefully peruse the data dictionary before they start using a data set? Probably not, but I hope that folks are, because we are working very hard to make sure that documentation is available. And the other thing that we're doing is we run a program called the Open Data Ambassadors, where we have volunteers from across the city. Some of them are city employees, some of them are librarians, some of them are just sort of civic technology enthusiasts, who are trained on a curriculum that is specifically designed to help people start to think about data analysis and using open data as a sort of jumping off point into how to formulate a good question that is answerable with a data set, how to think about the different considerations of whether or not the data is appropriate to answer that question, how to do sort of like basic summary statistics, or think about aggregating data in different ways. It's hard to do at scale, obviously. We're not going to reach every single person that is using an open data set, but we are making those trainings. Anybody can request a training from an open data ambassador on the Open Data website. So that's definitely something that we're thinking a lot about. And we just a quick plug from us, in March is New York City's Open Data Week, which is a week-long celebration of all things open data. And we'll have trainings, and we'll have sessions with different data owners. We'll have cool data art. So if folks are interested in checking that out, the website is opendata.nyc.gov.
What we will do, because Martha, you've mentioned a link, and Stephen, you mentioned the case studies as well from Mastercard, and Neil, you mentioned your LinkedIn stuff. So we'll make sure we send all of that out to everybody who is watching and who registered for this webinar as well. We can do that afterwards. Thanks, Martha. Neil, I'm going to direct the next one to you, but I think also to Elise and Stephen this one, and it kind of builds on that one. So that was about how do you make sure the public understand data. This one is more about how do you make sure officials have enough understanding of data, basically. And it comes from Georgia Litwin, and she said, is there a need to increase data awareness in employees who aren't traditionally data focused? Or can this be achieved in silos? So I guess, do you still have your data professionals, or do you need to have a basic level of data literacy now across the public sector? Your thoughts, Steve, on Neil, on this one.
Short answer, yes, we need to increase data understanding. I don't like the term data literacy, but it's data understanding and how to use data and stuff like that. Now, we're really, really fortunate in the UK is that the head of the civil service, Simon Case, has decided that the one big thing that every UK civil servant should do if they're going to do one piece of training this year is data training. So we're actually rolling out a project called One Big Thing, and we're encouraging every civil servant in the country to do at least 1 day's data training. I mean, we're focusing quite a lot on how you use data and all the rest of it. But the other element as well is, and you sort of obliquely touch on this point with the second point of that question, is that if you're creating silos of data expertise, you're not democratizing the data. It's a bit like if you go into a restaurant, you know, if you go into a restaurant, you do have a kitchen where the chef's pulling things together, but the customer needs to make the choice of what meal to have. And especially those restaurants where you've got choices of meals coming around on a conveyor belt and you can pick and choose it. You know, you need to make informed choices, and you can only do that if you actually understand what you're doing. It goes back to some of Stephen's points earlier. And the important thing in democratizing data, touching a little bit on the previous question as well, is to understand how people absorb and use things. So we spend a lot of time with psychologists about how people absorb information and looking at it from user persona. So if you've got a person down the pub, they will have a different user need of the same data that an academic expert who frankly knows much more about this than I could ever dream to imagine. And so you have to look at different ways in open data of putting that information out, either within the civil service, within the public sector, and without. And I think within the public sector as well, one of the best ways of doing that is teaching about how to understand what a big number is, how to be comfortable with uncertainty. What's that quote? All economic models are wrong, but some are useful. You know, not letting perfection get in the way of the good, understanding how to draw the signal out from the noise, you know, basic usage principles. And once you've got that, you know, you can then democratize a lot easier.
Thanks.
I think we should be doing more user research in pubs.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I was thinking the Yo Sushi approach, because you were talking about the kind of, you know, things going around on a conveyor belt. Elise, your thoughts very quickly, because I've just realized how little time we've got left, but your thoughts on this same issue.
I think democratizing data is such a great concept, Neil, and I think that's what we're getting at too. And maybe too, I would say, convincing people that a lot of people are afraid of data, right? There's that mathematics scary thing with the numbers and everything else. And I think getting people comfortable with data, understanding the limits, understanding that it's a tool, it's not the end all be all of everything, I think is important. So I really like your idea of open data ambassador, Martha. I'll follow up with you on that one for sure. But it's really about that, like data is your friend, and it can help you in what you do. And it's a lot about that behavior, and everybody is a data person in an organization, whether they know it or not. So making them embrace that is important as well, and their responsibility on the quality of the data that they put in the system and everything else. So it's a bit of a feeding circle, right? Like it's an important change. It goes back to what I was saying in the opening. It's about the people, right? It's really all about the people.
Yeah. Thanks, Elise. Stephen, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I echo what the participants said, and I'd add another element. So one is definitely to be trained in it, but two is also how to protect it and understand the risk of that data. So as the government collects more data, as private sector is sharing more data, cities are beginning to be attacked everywhere. I mean, you don't have to be a large city, and that data is valuable to somebody else, right? And so we're doing the private sector a lot of training on understanding data, but also the importance to protect data and passwords and these standard security steps. So I think it's training on what you can do with data, but also the importance of protecting that data and protecting your environment from getting infiltrated that can use that data for harm. So
Yeah, really
I think
good.
that goes hand in hand.
We haven't really got into the data security side of things. I think we probably need a whole nother follow-up webinar just on the data
Yeah.
security side of things. I think we've got time very quickly. We'll have to keep the answers really short, I'm afraid, because this is probably the final round of questions. We've got a couple that we can choose from. Luckily, I think that two of these questions are very similar, so I'm going to combine them and just say, really take what Satisha said, which is how do we ensure good data quality? I know, Elise, you said we shouldn't wait for it to be perfect to start, but how do we actually get people to understand the importance of the quality of data? So you can either answer that question, or the other one came in from Georgia, which was about how do you overcome, and I think it's those cultural barriers you're talking about, Elise, how do you overcome barriers to adopting more creative approaches to gathering and sharing data? So these are two questions. Answer one or the other. Martha, I'll start with you.
I think both of them kind of, I think, really touch on thinking about data generation and collection as a partnership with the folks who are actually generating and collecting information. And I think part of that is demonstrating back to folks who are on the ground, working with citizens, working on in sort of frontline data collection roles, what we're going to do with that data, or what we can do with that data, and why the quality of that data is important. I think, if you've ever had it, I have had jobs where my job is to like enter lots of data into a system, or to do data collection, and it is occasionally boring and thankless. And a lot of people, I think the more you can kind of connect like the folks who are responsible for collecting information, and also citizens who are giving up their information or volunteering their information, how can we make sure that we're demonstrating, what's happening with that information, what's happening with that data, and how are we using it to help improve our services, to help better serve New Yorkers.
To be clear on the benefits.
Exactly.
Yeah, thanks. Stephen, your thoughts on barriers to kind of different ways of doing things or improving the quality of data?
Yeah, I think from what we've learned, just kind of dumping data over the wall is not a good way. And so I think bringing people in early on the process, what's the question, and then helping them work through that question set with our data and jointly and together. I think Martha and our team did a really good job with that. It did a couple things. One, it got the quality of data up, or the understanding of that quality of data up. And then it also built trust, because they understand the data more, they know what it's doing. We've been able to test and refine it and work through it together. What does it mean? What does it not? And so by the end of that, as people begin to understand things more, they become less opposed to using it in those ways. So I think a transaction-based data relationship is not the best way. I think one that's more of a continuous partnership data engagement is the right way, one way to approach it.
Thanks, Stephen. Elise.
Absolutely, demonstrate the value. Why bring the people together from the different angles of the challenge that you're trying to get to, define that question, that problem together, and then work together through. I think it's through partnership and collaboration, understanding everybody's contribution, and how much you can lighten the load on the front line, how much you can lighten the load on your recipient, and provide that information back to them is incredible. I think that's where you get buy-in pretty quickly.
Thanks, Elise. Neil, I started with you, so I'm going to finish with you. You can answer those both questions that we've already touched on here. I'm going to throw in one final thing, which was from Naomi, which is, do we really need data to support what we already know? So what she's saying is, do we sometimes use it as an excuse to delay a policy decision?
I mean, sorry, no, I'm going to come on the data quality thing. So I think that is really, really important. And one of the 10 things that you should always ask when you're getting data is, first of all, I always say to people, if at all possible, acquire the data that an organization is already using for its own purposes, its own business processes, because if they're using the data, they'll have their own data quality processes in place, because they will want to be making the right decisions based on good quality data themselves. If you're asking for someone to enter data into a black hole, the only way that you can do good data quality there is to get the buy-in and trust of the individual. So during COVID, I had to get some aggregated data daily for all sorts of reasons. I spent a lot of time with the unions, with head teachers, with directors of children's care, saying why we needed this information and why it was really, really important in us as a government managing the COVID crisis. And because of that, people put more time and effort into a burdensome collection as possible. And very finally, you know, why do we collect data if we already know it? Well, maybe I'll push back. Do we actually already know it, or do we just suppose it? Because if the evidence isn't already out there, we might be just playing on our prejudices. Really important thing to me is that if there is data out there, then we can reference it and we can source it. So if we're having an argument against someone who has a different principled position, you know, as long as you can agree on the facts behind it, then you're very good. You know, it's absolutely right that your personal politics, your personal principles will feed off those facts. And I don't really care where you come to on that one, as long as the facts are right, because that to me is democracy. I'm going to end on a big note. Having open data that people can trust is the foundation of a democratic process and a democratic system, because then if you put the insight out there, people can choose to use it wisely or not. People can formulate their own views on opinions on facts and not fake facts.
Yeah. Brilliant. What a brilliant note to end on, the whole of democracy being underpinned by trustworthy, robust data. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Neil, to Martha, to Elise, and to Stephen. Brilliant opening presentations, but also thank you for giving us so much of your time and your expertise in answering all those questions. Thank you to the audience for sending in so many great questions as well and engaging so well in this webinar. Thanks to MasterCard for being our knowledge partner for today's webinar. What we will do is we'll make sure that we send the link with this video to everybody who watched today, but also everybody who registered, because I know we have lots of people on different time zones. They'll be able to watch that on catch up. You can share it with your colleagues as well if you think other people will be interested. There will also be an article written with the key issues that came out of that discussion today, and we will share that similarly with everybody in a week or so's time. But thank you so much from me to our panel, to our great audience. I hope to see you again on one of our other webinars very soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day wherever you are. Thanks.
Thank you.